The night was darker than usual, and the cold wind howled through the empty streets. A man, wrapped in a long coat, walked alone, his footsteps echoing against the silent buildings. His name was Ayan, a quiet and reserved man, always lost in his own thoughts. He had just finished his late night shift and was heading home, taking his usual shortcut through an old, abandoned alley. The alley was infamous for its eerie silence and broken streetlights, but Ayan never paid much attention to it. To him, it was just a path like any other. As he stepped onto the cracked pavement, a strange feeling crept over him. It felt as if someone was watching him. He stopped for a moment, turning his head slightly, but there was no one behind him. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, he continued walking. The air felt heavier, almost pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. He quickened his pace, but the moment he did, he heard something, soft footsteps matching his own. Ayan's heart pounded. He turned around again, his eyes scanning the darkness. The street was empty, the dim glow of a flickering streetlight the only source of light. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but deep down, something felt terribly wrong. He pulled his coat tighter around him and kept walking, his ears sharp, listening for any sound. Then, suddenly he saw a shadow move at the corner of the alley. It was quick, almost like a flash, but he was sure he had seen it. His breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer, just silence. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on the spot where he had seen the shadow. As he reached the corner, his phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. He quickly pulled it out, his hands trembling. The screen showed an unknown number. His heart raced as he hesitated, then pressed the answer button. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a faint breathing sound. Then a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, but clear enough to send chills down his spine. "Don't turn around." The call disconnected. Ayan's body froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but something held him in place. The air around him grew colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. He clenched his fist, trying to steady his breath. Slowly, he turned his head, despite the warning, and then Ayan turned around, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted across the alley, scanning every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing, just the cold wind swirling the dry leaves around his feet. His fingers tightened around his phone, the whisper from the call still echoing in his mind. A sudden rustling sound came from behind a dumpster. His body stiffened. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. "Who's there?" he called out again, his voice firmer this time. Silence. Then, out of nowhere, a stray cat dashed out, knocking over an empty bottle. Ayan exhaled sharply, almost laughing at himself. "Damn it," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. It was just a cat. Trying to shake off the fear, he turned to leave. But just as he took a step, his phone buzzed again. He froze. The same unknown number. His thumb hovered over the screen before he hesitantly answered. "Who is this?" he demanded. This time there was no breathing, no whisper, just a low, distorted voice. "You shouldn't have turned around." Ayan's stomach dropped. His grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The line went dead. Panic surged through him. His eyes darted around, but the alley was still empty. He needed to get out of there, now. He started walking faster, his feet moving on their own. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. He could feel it, someone was there. Then he heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were faster, heavier, not his own. Someone was following him. He broke into a run, his breath sharp and quick. The alley felt endless, the darkness stretching before him. His legs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Suddenly, his foot caught on something. He stumbled forward, crashing onto the pavement. His phone slipped from his hand, sliding a few feet away. He groaned, pushing himself up. His hands were scraped, his knee throbbing. But before he could grab his phone, a shadow loomed over him. His blood ran cold. He looked up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. There, standing just a few feet away, was a tall figure, dressed in all black, face hidden in the darkness, silent, still. Ayan's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to move, to run, but he was frozen in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. The air around them felt suffocating, as if the entire world had gone still. Then the figure took a step forward. Ayan's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the figure took another step forward. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, shifting shadows that made the figure seem even more menacing. Ayan's phone was still on the ground, the screen cracked from the fall. He glanced at it for a split second, considering grabbing it, but before he could move, the figure lunged. A sharp, cold grip wrapped around his wrist, yanking him up with terrifying strength. Ayan barely had time to react before he was shoved against the rough brick wall. His back hit the cold surface with a force that knocked the air out of his lungs. He gasped, struggling, but the figure's grip tightened. Who are you?" he choked out, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure remained silent, but now Ayan could see them up close. Though their face was obscured by a hood, he could make out something unsettling. Gloved hands, but with a strange texture, almost like scales? No, it had to be his mind playing tricks on him. Then the figure finally spoke. The voice was low, distorted, and chillingly calm. "You shouldn't have answered the call." Ayan's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" he stammered, his mind racing. The grip on his wrist tightened further. Ayan winced in pain. "You were warned," the figure continued, "but you didn't listen." His breathing grew uneven. Was this some kind of sick joke? A prank gone too far? "Look, if this is about the call, I don't even know who—" Before he could finish, the figure suddenly let go. Ayan stumbled forward, gasping for breath, clutching his wrist where the grip had left deep red marks. He backed away, his body shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked away. Ayan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His body screamed for him to run, to leave this alley and never look back. But something about the figure's words lingered in his mind. "You shouldn't have answered the call." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he bent down to pick up his phone. The screen flickered to life, but before he could check it, the phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Ayan's pulse skyrocketed. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the answer button. Every nerve in his body told him not to throw the phone away, to run. But instead, with a deep, shaky breath, he pressed his thumb down. He lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello?" A long pause. Then, the same distorted voice. "This isn't over." The line went dead. Ayan's hands went numb. His entire body felt cold, despite the sweat forming on his forehead. He glanced around the alley, his eyes darting to where the figure had vanished. But there was nothing. Only silence. This was no coincidence, no random threat. Someone, something, had chosen him. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. Ayan stood there, gripping his phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The distorted voice, the warning, the mysterious figure, none of it made sense. His breathing was erratic as he forced himself to move, to get out of the alley. He needed to go home, to be somewhere safe. But deep down, he knew nowhere was safe anymore. As he stepped onto the main road, the city seemed strangely quiet. The usual noise of traffic and distant chatter had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. It felt like the world had momentarily stopped. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Ayan's heart pounded in his chest. His first instinct was to ignore it, to throw the phone away and pretend this nightmare wasn't real. But something inside him refused to let go. With a trembling hand, he answered. He didn't say anything this time. He just held the phone to his ear, waiting. Silence. Then, breathing, slow, deliberate, too close. A chill ran down his spine. He could almost feel someone standing right behind him. He turned around so fast, he nearly dropped his phone. Nothing. But then, a low whisper directly in his ear. You can't escape. Ayan's body locked up, his breath hitched. The voice hadn't come from the phone, it had come from right next to him. He bolted, his feet hit the pavement hard as he ran through the empty streets, his heartbeat drowning out everything else. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. But no matter how fast he ran, the feeling of being watched never left him. He reached his apartment, practically throwing himself inside and locking the door behind him. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, trying to calm himself. Safe. He was safe now. Or so he thought. His phone vibrated in his hand. Another message. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from his own. Look outside. Ayan's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, with every muscle in his body screaming at him not to, he turned toward the window. The street below was empty, completely still. Then a shadow moved. Not a person, not something human, and it was looking right at him. Ayan stumbled backward, his vision blurring with panic. His phone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. The screen lit up one last time. It's too late. The lights in his apartment flickered, and then darkness.